The morning started like any other at Kensington Palace. Prince William stood by the large window in his private study, watching the early London fog roll across the palace gardens. His hands trembled slightly as he held the official document. That had arrived just an hour earlier. Kate noticed his unusual silence during breakfast and the way he kept glancing toward his phone, which had been buzzing constantly since dawn. "You've barely touched your tea," Kate observed, setting down her own cup with concern evident in her voice. William forced a smile, but she could see right through it. After 15 years together, she knew every expression that crossed his face. Something was terribly wrong, and he was trying to shield her from it. The children had already left for school, their cheerful chatter still echoing in the hallway. George had been excited about his science project. Charlotte had practiced her piano piece one more time before leaving, and little Louis had insisted on wearing his favorite dinosaur shirt. The normalcy of their morning routine now felt precious and fragile in light of what William had learned. Kate reached across the breakfast table and placed her hand over his. His skin felt cold, and she could feel the tension in his muscles. "William, whatever it is, we can face it together. We always have." Her voice was steady, but inside her heart was racing. She had seen him handle countless royal duties, public appearances, and family matters, but this was different. The palace staff moved quietly around them, preparing for the day's scheduled activities. William's private secretary had already called, twice, and there were several urgent messages from other members of the royal household. The atmosphere in the palace had shifted subtly since the early morning, with staff members speaking in hushed tones and casting worried glances toward the family's private quarters. William finally looked up from the document, his blue eyes reflecting a pain that Kate had rarely seen. "There's something I need to show you," he said quietly. "But first, I need you to know that whatever happens, our family comes first. The children's safety and happiness are what matter most." His words sent a chill down Kate's spine. She nodded, squeezing his hand tighter. "Of course. What is it?" But even as she asked, she could see him struggling with how much to reveal. The weight of royal responsibility had always been heavy on his shoulders, but this seemed different. This seemed personal. William stood up slowly, the document still clutched in his other hand. "We need to go upstairs. There's something in Father's old study that I discovered this morning when the palace archivists were going through some recently found papers." His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might make whatever he had learned more real. Kate felt her chest tighten. King Charles had only recently settled into his role, and the family was still adjusting to the new dynamics. The discovery of old papers wasn't unusual in a palace with centuries of history, but William's reaction suggested this was no ordinary historical document. As they walked up the grand staircase, Kate noticed how William's footsteps seemed heavier than usual. The portraits of past monarchs looked down at them from their gilded frames, silent witnesses to generations of royal secrets and family dramas. The palace felt unusually quiet, with even the usual sounds of staff members going about their duties, seeming muted. They passed several closed doors before William stopped at one that Kate recognized as belonging to a study that had been locked for months. Palace staff had mentioned that archivists were working on cataloging items from various royal collections, but she hadn't paid much attention to the details. Now, seeing William's pale complexion and the way his hand shook as he reached for the door handle, she wished she had asked more questions. "Before we go in," William said, turning to face her completely, "I need you to promise me that no matter what we find, we'll handle this together. The children cannot know about this until we decide how to proceed." His eyes were pleading now, and Kate could see tears forming that he was desperately trying to hold back. She reached up and touched his face gently. "William, you're scaring me. What could possibly be so terrible?" But even as she asked, her mind was racing through possibilities. Royal families had weathered many storms throughout history, but something about this felt different. Something about the way he was acting suggested that this discovery could change everything they thought they knew about their family. William took a deep breath and placed his hand on the door handle. The metal was cold beneath his palm, and for a moment, he hesitated. Once they opened this door and saw what lay beyond, there would be no going back. The comfortable world they had built for themselves and their children would be forever changed. Kate placed her hand over his on the door handle. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," she repeated, her voice strong despite the fear she felt growing inside her chest. She could see the internal battle William was fighting, the conflict between protecting her from whatever lay beyond that door and needing her support to face it. The corridor around them seemed to hold its breath as William finally turned the handle. The old hinges creaked slightly as the door began to open, revealing darkness beyond. Neither of them could have prepared for what they were about to discover, or how it would shake the very foundations of everything they believed about their family's history. The study was dimly lit, with heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light. As William reached for the light switch, Kate could see boxes scattered across the floor and papers spread across the large wooden desk that dominated the room. The air smelled of old leather and dust, mixed with something else she couldn't quite identify. The palace archivists had clearly been working here for some time, but their organized system had given way to what looked like frantic searching. William's hands were shaking more noticeably now as he approached the desk. Among the scattered documents, one particular folder lay open, its contents partially visible. Kate could see old photographs, official-looking documents with royal seals, and what appeared to be personal letters written in careful handwriting. The folder itself was marked with a date from over 30 years ago, long before William and Kate had even met. The archivists found this hidden behind a false panel in the wall, William explained, his voice hollow. It was concealed so well that it took them weeks of careful examination to discover it. They called me immediately when they realized what they had found. He picked up one of the photographs with trembling fingers, and Kate could see it was a picture of a young woman she didn't recognize, but whose eyes seemed strangely familiar. Kate moved closer, studying the photograph over William's shoulder. The woman in the picture was beautiful, with dark hair and expressive eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She was standing in what looked like the gardens of Kensington Palace, but the image had the quality of something taken in secret, as if the photographer had been hiding. "Who is she?" Kate whispered, though something deep in her heart already feared the answer. William set the photograph down and picked up a letter written on official palace stationery. His voice cracked as he began to read aloud. "My dearest William, if you are reading this, then the truth I have carried for so many years has finally come to light. There are things about our family that were kept hidden to protect the crown, but perhaps it is time for you to know." The letter was signed with a name that made Kate's blood run cold. The signature belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales, but it was dated just weeks before her tragic death in Paris. Kate felt her legs grow weak as the implications began to sink in. Diana had hidden this information somewhere she knew William would eventually find it, but only when he was ready to handle the truth. The careful placement behind the false panel suggested this was meant to be discovered only after many years had passed. William continued reading, his voice barely audible now. "The woman in the photograph was someone your father loved deeply before he married me. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, and she worked as a translator at the palace during the early 1980s. What Charles never knew, what I only discovered by accident, was that Elena was carrying his child when she suddenly disappeared from the palace." The letter slipped from William's fingers and fluttered to the floor. Kate felt the room spinning around her. The implications were staggering. If what Diana had written was true, then William had a half-sibling somewhere in the world. Someone who had been hidden away to protect the reputation of the royal family. The timing would have been crucial, as Charles was being pressured to marry and produce an heir, and a scandal involving an illegitimate child could have damaged the monarchy irreparably. William picked up another document from the folder. This, one bearing official palace seals and signatures from senior courtiers. Kate could see it was some kind of agreement or contract, written in formal legal language. "They paid her to disappear," William said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and grief. Elena was given a substantial sum of money and relocated to another country under a new identity. In exchange, she agreed never to make contact with the royal family or reveal the child's parentage. The weight of this revelation was overwhelming. Kate thought about their own children, sleeping peacefully in their beds each night, secure in their identity and place in the world. Somewhere out there was another person who shared William's bloodline, someone who had grown up never knowing their true heritage. The injustice of it made her heart ache, but she also understood the impossible position the palace had been in during those turbulent times. William walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains, letting natural light flood the room. The sudden brightness revealed even more documents scattered across the floor, as if the archivists had been working frantically to piece together the full story. "There's more," he said without turning around. "Diana spent years trying to track down what happened to Elena and the child. She hired private investigators, used her own contacts, anything she could think of to find them." Kate picked up another photograph from the desk, this one showing a young boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The resemblance to William was unmistakable. The same bone structure, the same thoughtful expression, even the same way of holding his head slightly tilted when caught off guard by the camera. The photograph was dated 15 years ago, suggesting that Diana had been successful in her search, at least partially. "She found them," William continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Elena settled in Argentina and raised the boy as her own. She never married, never told him who his real father was. Diana was planning to tell me everything when I turned 30, when she felt I would be mature enough to handle the truth and make my own decision about what to do with the information." His shoulders shook as he fought back tears. The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them. Diana had died just months before she planned to reveal this family secret to William. Knowledge had been buried with her, hidden away in the palace walls until chance and time brought it back to light. Kate wondered how many other secrets were hidden within these ancient walls, how many other lives had been affected by the need to protect the crown at all costs. William finally turned from the window, his face streaked with tears he could no longer hold back. "Kate, I have a brother I've never met. Somewhere in Argentina, there's a young man who has no idea that his father is the King of England and that he has family here who would want to know him." The full weight of the situation was finally hitting him, and Kate could see the internal struggle between his duty to the crown and his desire to right this historical wrong. Kate went to him and wrapped her arms around him, feeling his body shake with suppressed sobs. They stood there in the dusty study, surrounded by the evidence of a decades-old secret, both of them trying to process the magnitude of what they had discovered and what it might mean for their family's future. For the next several hours, William and Kate sat on the floor of the study, carefully examining every document in the hidden folder. Each piece of paper revealed another layer of the story that had been concealed for so long. There were bank records showing regular payments made to an account in Buenos Aires, medical records that had somehow been obtained, and even school reports for a boy named Miguel Rodriguez, who had grown up believing his father was a businessman, who died when he was young. Kate found herself studying every photograph with increasing fascination and heartbreak. Miguel looked so much like William at the same age that there could be no doubt about his parentage. In one picture, he was playing football with friends in what appeared to be a schoolyard, his face lit up with joy and completely unaware that half a world away, he had 3 young cousins who shared his love for the same sport. "Look at this," William said softly, holding up a letter written in Spanish. Diana had it translated, Elena wrote to her mother in Spain, telling her about the pregnancy and how frightened she was. She says that Charles was kind to her, but that she knew their relationship could never be anything more than what it was. She was 22 years old and completely alone when the palace officials came to see her. Kate could feel her anger building as she read the translation. Elena had been little more than a girl herself, working at the palace to support her family back in Spain. The letter described how she had fallen in love with the future king, believing that perhaps their connection was real and lasting. Instead, she found herself facing the full power of the royal establishment, with officials making it clear that her only option was to disappear quietly and never speak of what had happened. William found another document that made his hands tremble with rage. It was an internal memo between senior palace officials discussing Elena as if she were nothing more than a problem to be solved. The cold, bureaucratic language used to describe her situation and plan her removal from their lives was horrifying in its casual cruelty. They had discussed her as if she were an object to be relocated, not a young woman whose life they were destroying. They gave her 48 hours to make a decision, William read from the memo. Accept the money and relocation or face the consequences of bringing scandal to the crown. They made it clear that if she refused, they would destroy her reputation and make it impossible for her to find work anywhere in Europe. His voice was filled with a cold fury that Kate had never heard from him before. The more they read, the more the full picture emerged. Elena had been genuinely in love with Charles, and according to Diana's notes, Charles had cared deeply for her as well. But the weight of royal duty and the pressure from advisors had made it impossible for him to protect her when the pregnancy was discovered. Diana's investigation had revealed that Charles never knew about the child until years later, when it was too late to change what had happened. Kate picked up a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. These were Elena's letters to Charles, letters that had apparently never been delivered. In them, she poured out her heart, telling him about their son, about how much the boy resembled him, about her hopes that someday they might be reunited. The letters became increasingly desperate over the years, as Elena realized that no response would ever come. She wrote to him every year on Miguel's birthday, Kate said, her own tears falling onto the aged paper. 28 letters that he never saw. She told him about Miguel's first words, his first steps, his achievements in school, everything a father would want to know about his son. The tragedy of the missed connection between father and son was overwhelming. William discovered that Diana had actually made contact with Elena shortly before her death. There was a record of phone calls between them, and Elena had agreed to meet with Diana during what would have been Diana's next visit to Argentina. The meeting was scheduled for October 1997, just 2 months after Diana's fatal accident in Paris. Once again, cruel timing had intervened to keep this family separated. Among the documents was a more recent letter, dated just 5 years ago. Elena had written to the palace once more after seeing news reports about William's wedding to Kate. In the letter, she expressed her hope that perhaps the new generation might be more open to acknowledging Miguel's existence. She mentioned that Miguel had become a teacher in Buenos Aires and was engaged to a lovely young woman who knew nothing about his true parentage. "She's still alive," William whispered, staring at the return address on the envelope. "Elena is still alive. And so is Miguel. They're both living in Buenos Aires, just carrying on with their lives while we had no idea they existed." The realization that his half-brother was out there, living as a complete stranger, was almost too much to bear. Kate found a business card tucked into one of the folders. It belonged to a private investigator in London who had apparently continued Diana's work even after her death. A handwritten note on the back indicated that he had maintained occasional contact with Elena over the years, simply to ensure her well-being and to keep track of Miguel's development. The investigator was apparently still alive and working, which meant there might be even more recent information available. William stood up and walked to the window again, staring out at the gardens where Elena had once walked, where the photograph had been taken all those years ago. "Kate, what are we supposed to do with this information? Miguel is 28 years old. He has built a life believing he knows who he is. Do we have the right to turn his world upside down by telling him the truth?" Kate joined him at the window, placing her hand on his shoulder. "But don't we also have a responsibility to give him the choice? He's your brother, William. He's part of this family whether he knows it or not. And somewhere out there, Elena is growing older, still carrying this secret alone." She could see the impossible decision weighing on her husband's mind. They stood together in silence for a long moment, both of them thinking about their own children and how they would feel if they discovered such a massive secret about their family. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming, with no clear right or wrong answer. Whatever they decided to do would have consequences that rippled far beyond just their immediate family. William picked up the most recent photograph of Miguel, taken apparently without his knowledge as he left his school at the end of a working day. He looked happy and content, surrounded by students who clearly admired him. "He looks like he has a good life," William said quietly. "Maybe we don't have the right to disrupt that, even if our intentions are good." Kate couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed beside William, listening to his restless turning and quiet sighs, knowing that his mind was racing with the same questions that plagued her own thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Miguel's face from the photographs, so remarkably similar to her husband's features. She imagined him going about his daily routine in Buenos Aires, completely unaware that his life was connected to the British royal family in the most fundamental way possible. At dawn, William was already awake, sitting by the window with Diana's folder in his lap. Kate could see that he had been crying again, and her heart ached for the impossible position he found himself in. "I keep thinking about Mother," he said without looking up from the documents. "She spent years carrying this burden alone, trying to figure out the right thing to do. Now it's fallen to us and I feel completely lost." Kate made tea for both of them and sat beside him on the window seat. The morning light revealed new details in the photographs they hadn't noticed the day before. In one picture of Miguel playing with children who were obviously his students, Kate could see the same gentle patience in his expression that she recognized in William when he interacted with George, Charlotte, and Louis. The family resemblance went beyond physical features to encompass mannerisms and expressions. "I called the private investigator whose card we found," William admitted quietly. "His name is James Morrison, and he agreed to meet with us this afternoon. He says he has information that isn't in these files, things that Diana discovered but didn't have time to document before she died." Kate felt a mixture of hope and apprehension at this news. More information might help them make a decision, but it could also make the situation even more complicated. Throughout the morning, they tried to maintain their normal routine for the children's sake. George had a football match, Charlotte had piano lessons, and Louis wanted help with a puzzle. But both William and Kate found it difficult to focus on everyday activities when such a monumental secret was weighing on their minds. Several times, Kate caught William staring at his children with an expression of profound sadness, as if seeing them reminded him of the childhood that Miguel had experienced without knowing his true family. The meeting with James Morrison took place in a private room at a discreet hotel in central London. The investigator was an elderly man with kind eyes and careful manner of speaking that suggested years of dealing with sensitive family matters. He had known Diana personally and spoke of her with genuine affection and respect. "The princess was determined to right this wrong," he explained. She felt tremendous guilt about what had happened to Elena, even though she had no part in the original decision. Morrison spread additional photographs and documents across the table between them. These were more recent images of Miguel, showing him at various stages of his adult life. Kate was struck by how normal and happy he appeared in all of them. He had friends, a career he clearly loved, and according to Morrison, had recently become engaged to a woman named Sophia who worked at the same school where he taught mathematics and literature. Elena never remarried, Morrison continued. She devoted her entire life to raising Miguel and giving him the best opportunities she could provide. She worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, and he earned a scholarship to university. Based on his academic achievements, by every measure, she succeeded in giving him a wonderful life despite the difficult circumstances of his birth. William asked the question that had been haunting him since discovering the documents. Does Elena regret the decision she made? Does she wish she had fought harder to stay in England and tell the truth about Miguel's parentage? Morrison's answer was not what either of them expected. Elena has never regretted protecting Miguel from the scrutiny and pressure that would have come with being acknowledged as a royal child, Morrison replied carefully. But she has always hoped that someday, when Miguel was old enough to make his own decisions, he might have the opportunity to know his father and his British family. She's followed news about Prince Charles and about both of you through the years, taking quiet pride in the family Miguel never knew he belonged to. Kate felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the depth of Elena's sacrifice. This woman had given up any chance of her son knowing his heritage, his father, or his half-brother, all to protect him from a life that might have been filled with obligation and public scrutiny rather than the simple happiness he had found as a teacher in Buenos Aires. Morrison pulled out a letter that Elena had written just 6 months earlier after seeing news coverage of a charity event that William had attended with underprivileged children. She was so proud watching him interact with those children, Morrison translated from Elena's Spanish writing. She said Miguel has the same natural way with young people, the same instinct to protect and guide them. She wondered if those qualities came from his father's side of the family. The investigator then shared information that changed everything they thought they knew about the situation. Elena is ill, he said gently. She was diagnosed with cancer 8 months ago, and while she's responding well to treatment, the diagnosis made her realize that Miguel might soon lose the only family he's ever known without ever learning the truth about where he came from. William's face went pale as the implications sank in. Time was no longer on their side in making this decision. If Elena's health declined, Miguel would be left completely alone in the world, never knowing that he had a father, a stepmother, a half-brother, and 3 young cousins who would welcome him with open hearts if they only knew he existed. Morrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out one final item that made both William and Kate gasp. It was a recent letter addressed to Prince William, written in Elena's careful handwriting. She asked me to deliver this to you if I ever had the opportunity, Morrison explained. She doesn't expect a response, but she wanted you to know that Miguel exists and to let you decide whether that information should remain a secret or become something more. William's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Elena's letter was written in English, though her Spanish accent came through in her choice of words and phrasing. She told him about Miguel's childhood, his achievements, his dreams of traveling to Europe someday to see the places his mother had described from her youth. She mentioned that Miguel had always been curious about his father, but had accepted Elena's explanation that it was too painful to discuss. At the end of the letter, Elena made a simple request that brought tears to both William and Kate's eyes. If anything happens to me, I hope you might find a way to let Miguel know that he was conceived in love, not scandal, and that his father was a good man who would have been proud of the person Miguel has become. I do not ask for money or recognition, only that my son might someday understand that he came from a family with a tradition of service and compassion. William folded the letter carefully and looked at Kate with eyes full of determination. We have to go to Argentina, he said quietly. We can't make this decision from a distance. We need to meet Elena and Miguel and then decide together what's best for everyone involved. The flight to Buenos Aires felt endless. William and Kate traveled under assumed names, with only their most trusted security detail aware of their true destination. They had told the children they were taking a brief working trip, hating the necessity of keeping secrets, but knowing that until they understood the full situation, discretion was essential. Kate watched William stare out the airplane window for hours, clearly rehearsing in his mind what he might say when he met Elena and Miguel for the first time. James Morrison had arranged everything carefully. Elena lived in a modest apartment in the San Telmo neighborhood, and Miguel had his own small place just a few blocks away. Morrison had contacted Elena to let her know that William wanted to meet her, but they had agreed not to tell Miguel anything until after the initial meeting. The plan was to approach the situation gradually, allowing everyone time to process the emotional complexity of the reunion. Their hotel was a small, family-run establishment that Morrison had chosen specifically because it was unlikely to attract attention from international media. William and Kate registered under false names and kept to their room as much as possible, venturing out only for brief walks to familiarize themselves with the neighborhood where Miguel had grown up. Kate was struck by how different this world was from the palaces and formal gardens where their own children were being raised. On their second day in Buenos Aires, Morrison brought them to a small cafe where Elena was waiting. Kate's first sight of Miguel's mother took her breath away. Elena was now in her 50s, with silver streaking through her dark hair, but she retained the same striking beauty that was evident in the decades-old photographs. More importantly, her eyes held a depth of wisdom and sadness that spoke of a life lived with tremendous dignity, despite unimaginable sacrifice. Elena stood when she saw William approach, and for a moment, both of them simply stared at each other, recognizing features they had seen in photographs but never expected to encounter in person. "You look so much like your father did at your age," Elena said quietly in accented English. "And you have his kind eyes." William's composure cracked, and Kate watched as tears began flowing down his cheeks. They sat at a corner table away from other patrons, and Elena began sharing stories about Miguel's childhood that the photographs and documents could never have conveyed. She told them about his first word, which was libro, because he had been fascinated by books from an incredibly early age. She described how he had always been protective of smaller children, often intervening when playground bullies picked on his classmates, displaying an instinctive sense of justice that reminded Elena of the stories she had heard about the British royal family. "He asked about his father constantly when he was young," Elena explained, her voice soft but steady. "I told him that his papa was a good man who had to go away before Miguel was born, and that he would have loved Miguel very much if he had been able to stay. It wasn't entirely untrue, but I know he sensed there was more to the story than I was telling him." Kate found herself completely drawn to this woman who had raised William's half-brother with such obvious love and dedication. Elena spoke about the sacrifices she had made without any hint of self-pity or resentment. She had worked as a seamstress, a cleaner, and eventually as a translator for tourist groups, always managing to provide for Miguel's needs while encouraging his academic pursuits. William asked the question that had been burning in his mind since discovering the hidden documents. "Do you regret the choice you made? Do you wish you had stayed in England and fought for recognition?" Elena's answer revealed the full depth of her character and the complexity of her feelings about the past. "I have never regretted protecting Miguel from a life that might have been filled with obligation and scrutiny rather than genuine happiness," she said carefully. "But I have always regretted that he grew up not knowing he had family who would have loved him. I watch him sometimes, and I see that he has questions about where he belongs in the world. Questions I cannot answer without revealing everything." Elena then shared something that surprised both William and Kate. Miguel had always been drawn to British culture and history, despite having no conscious knowledge of his connection to England. He had taught himself English by reading British literature, and his small apartment was filled with books by British authors. He had even applied for teaching positions in London several times, though he had never received responses to his applications. "It's as if some part of him knows," Elena said wonderfully. "He's always talking about wanting to visit England, especially the places connected to the royal family. He's fascinated by the history and traditions, and he follows news about your family with an interest that seems to go beyond normal curiosity." The conversation was interrupted when Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it quickly and smiled, though Kate could see tears forming in her eyes. "Miguel is at the school late tonight, working on lesson plans for next week. He does that often, staying after hours to prepare special activities for his students." She showed them a photograph Miguel had sent, showing an elaborate historical timeline he had created for his literature class, focusing on British authors and the historical periods in which they lived. Elena looked at both William and Kate with an expression that was both hopeful and terrified. "I need you to know that I'm not asking for anything for myself. The treatment for my illness is going well, and I have savings to cover my expenses. But if something happens to me, Miguel will be alone in the world, and he will never know that he has family who might care about him." William reached across the table and took Elena's hand in his. "You've given him an incredible life, and you've raised him to be someone our entire family would be proud to know. The question now is whether we have the right to change his world by telling him the truth, or whether we should respect the life you've built for him and let him continue believing what he's always believed." Elena's response was immediate and firm. "Miguel is 28 years old, and he deserves to make his own choice about whether he wants to know his family. I have protected him from this knowledge for his entire life. But perhaps it's time to let him decide for himself whether having royal blood is a blessing or a burden." Kate felt her heart racing as she realized they had reached the moment of decision. "When do you think we should tell him? How do you think he'll react when he learns that his father is the King of England and that he has been living his entire life not knowing his true identity?" Elena looked out the window of the cafe toward the direction of Miguel's school, where he was undoubtedly working late into the evening, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should tell him tomorrow evening when he comes for our usual Sunday dinner. It's time for the truth to finally come to light." Sunday evening arrived with an intensity that none of them were prepared for. Elena had spent the day cooking Miguel's favorite meal, just as she did every week, but her hands shook as she prepared the food they had shared countless times before. William and Kate waited in Elena's small but lovingly decorated apartment, surrounded by photographs of Miguel throughout his life, each image a testament to the bond between mother and son. At exactly 7 o'clock, they heard Miguel's familiar knock on the door. Elena had told him she had invited some friends to join them for dinner, but she had given no details about who these friends might be. Kate felt her heart pounding as Elena opened the door, and Miguel stepped inside, carrying a bouquet of flowers, for his mother as he did every Sunday. The moment Miguel entered the room and saw William, the flowers slipped from his hands and scattered across the floor. Kate watched as confusion, recognition, and disbelief played across his face in rapid succession. Even without knowing the truth, some instinctive part of him recognized the family resemblance that was impossible to ignore when they were in the same room together. "Mama, what's going on?" Miguel asked in Spanish, his eyes never leaving William's face. Elena guided him to sit down, speaking to him in their native language with a gentleness that clearly came from years of protecting him from difficult truths. Kate could see the exact moment when Elena began explaining the situation, because Miguel's expression changed from confusion to shock to something approaching devastation. For nearly 20 minutes, Elena spoke continuously in rapid Spanish, while Miguel sat in stunned silence. Occasionally, he would interrupt with a question, his voice growing more strained with each exchange. Kate didn't need to understand the language to recognize the emotional weight of what was being revealed. Miguel's entire world was being rewritten before his eyes, every assumption about his identity and family history crumbling and reforming into something completely different. When Elena finally finished speaking, the apartment fell into a silence, so profound that Kate could hear the tick of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Miguel stared at his hands for what felt like an eternity, processing information that would have been overwhelming for anyone to receive. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears, but his voice was remarkably steady when he spoke in careful English. "So you're telling me that my father is the King of England, and you," he looked directly at William, "are my half-brother?" The words sounded surreal, even as he spoke them, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was saying. William nodded, his own emotions clearly overwhelming him as he faced the brother he had never known existed. Miguel stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the familiar street where he had grown up. All these years, when I was fascinated by British history, when I felt drawn to England for reasons I couldn't explain, it was because part of me belonged there. His voice carried a mixture of wonder and profound sadness. All those times I applied for teaching positions in London, hoping to experience the culture I felt so connected to, I was trying to find my way home to a family I didn't know I had. Kate watched as William struggled with whether to approach Miguel or give him space to process this revelation. The situation was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced, with no protocol or guidebook for how to handle the discovery of a secret family member. Elena remained seated at the table, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son grapple with the truth she had hidden for nearly 3 decades. Miguel turned back to face them, and Kate was struck by how much he looked like William when he was deep in thought. "I understand why you made the choices you did, Mama," he said, switching back to Spanish briefly before returning to English. "But I feel like I've been living someone else's life. Every birthday, every achievement, every moment when I wished I had a father to share it with, he was there, just in a different country, not knowing I existed." William finally found his voice, standing slowly and taking a tentative step toward Miguel. "I only learned about you 3 days ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I had known, if any of us had known, we would have moved heaven and earth to be part of your life. You're not just my half-brother, Miguel. You're family, and family means everything to us." Miguel studied William's face intently, as if searching for signs of deception or ulterior motives. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Do you expect me to suddenly become a prince? Do I have obligations to the crown that I know nothing about? And what about Sophia, my fiancée? How do I explain to her that the man she fell in love with isn't who either of us thought he was?" Kate spoke for the first time since Miguel had arrived, her voice gentle but firm. "Nothing has to change unless you want it to change. You're a teacher, you're engaged to someone you love, and you have a life here that clearly brings you happiness. Learning about your heritage doesn't mean you have to give up who you've chosen to become." Elena reached for Miguel's hand, speaking in Spanish again, and Kate could see that she was reassuring him that no one expected him to abandon the life they had built together. Miguel listened carefully, then looked back at William with a question that neither of them had fully considered. "Do our father and your mother know that you're here? Do they know about me?" William shook his head. "We haven't told anyone yet. We wanted to meet you and Elena first, to understand the situation before, involving other family members. But yes, I believe they should know. And I think our father would want to meet you if you're willing." The weight of that possibility settled over all of them. King Charles, who had never known about the son he had fathered all those years ago, would soon learn that his relationship with Elena had resulted in a child who had grown into a remarkable young man. The complexity of emotions that revelation would trigger was almost unimaginable. Miguel sat back down, this time closer to William, and for the first time since entering the apartment, he smiled slightly. "I have so many questions," he said, "about our father, about our family, about what my life might have been like if things had been different. But I also want you to know that despite everything, I'm grateful for the life I've had. Elena gave me love, education, and the freedom to become who I wanted to be." As the evening progressed, they began to share stories that bridged the gap between their two worlds. William told Miguel about George, Charlotte, and Louis, showing him photographs and describing their personalities. Miguel shared stories about his students and his work, his engagement to Sophia, and his dreams of traveling to Europe. Kate watched as the two brothers slowly began to recognize not just their physical similarities, but the deeper character traits they shared. By the time they said goodbye that night, tentative plans had been made for Miguel to travel to England to meet the rest of his family. Elena would come too, finally returning to the country she had left under such difficult circumstances decades earlier. The secret that had been hidden behind palace walls for so long was finally being brought into the light, not with scandal or shame, but with love and the hope of healing old wounds. As William and Kate walked back to their hotel through the quiet streets of Buenos Aires, both of them felt the profound weight of what had just occurred. They had not only found a missing piece of their family, but they had also witnessed the power of truth to transform lives, even when that truth came decades later than it should have.